Isabel Hartman stood alone in the bridal suite on the top floor of the Hudson Valley lakefront estate. The soft afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting a gentle glow on her ivory gown. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the vintage pearl earrings, her grandmother's last gift before passing. The lace detailing of her dress shimmered subtly each time she drew a nervous breath. From the window, she could see guests filling the garden rows below, chatting cheerfully and sipping champagne, unaware that they might soon witness heartbreak instead of vows. "He's still not answering," Lily said from behind her, lowering her phone with a tight-lipped frown. "Probably just cold feet. Men get stupid before weddings." Isabel didn't respond. The pit in her stomach wasn't just nerves, it was something deeper. A quiet dread that had been whispering for days. Nathan, the man she was about to marry, had been distant lately. His kisses lacked warmth. His gaze never held hers long enough. But she had dismissed it all as pre-wedding stress. Told herself love didn't always feel like fireworks. Now, with 20 minutes until the ceremony, her instincts were screaming. "Lily," she murmured, staring at her reflection in the mirror, dark brown eyes wide with unease. "This isn't just lateness. Something's wrong." The door creaked open. Both women turned at once, expecting a flustered, apologetic Nathan. But the man in the doorway wasn't the groom. It was Julian Reed, Nathan's older brother. Tall, broad-shouldered, sharply dressed in a tailored black suit. A man whose presence seemed to command silence. Isabel had met him a few times at family dinners. He'd always been cool, distant, barely acknowledging her existence. "Julian," her voice cracked slightly. "Where's Nathan?" He stepped inside and shut the door behind him, movements smooth and deliberate. Nothing like Nathan's warmth. Julian radiated composed authority. "Nathan's not coming." His voice was calm, almost too calm. 3 words. That's all it took to shatter her world. Isabel's knees buckled slightly. Lily rushed forward, catching her before she could fall. "What the hell are you talking about?" Lily barked. "Where is he?" Julian held up his phone. A single message glowed on the screen. "I'm sorry, I can't do this. Tell Isabel I need time." The room spun around Isabel. "He left me," she whispered. Saying it aloud made it real and unbearable. Julian nodded, face expressionless. Nathan's always had a talent for running. A tear slipped down Isabel's cheek, trailing through her perfectly applied makeup. Months of planning. Every word Nathan had said about how she was different, how she'd changed him. Lies. "I need to go down there and tell everyone it's off," she said, voice trembling. Her hands that had healed children and held grieving mothers, now clenched uselessly at the fabric of her dress. "You don't have to," Julian said, stepping closer. His voice, low and steady, stirred something unfamiliar in her. "What do you mean?" "There's another option," he said simply. Lily stepped protectively in front of Isabel. "If this is some insane idea, now's not the time." Julian's eyes never left Isabel's. "Nathan won't come, but I can fix this, if you let me." Silence fell over the room after Julian's unexpected proposal. Isabel stared at him, convinced she had misheard. His eyes were too calm for a joke, too steady for sympathy. And yet, within their depth, something unmistakable flickered. A sincerity that startled her. "You just said you'd marry me?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he replied, unwavering. "There's a garden full of guests, a minister waiting, and a bride abandoned in her own wedding suite. You don't have to be humiliated." "You're insane," Lily interjected sharply. "This isn't the moment for some billionaire power play." But Isabel barely heard her. Her own pulse roared in her ears. The world had shattered too fast. Just minutes ago, she was about to walk down the aisle to marry Nathan. And now, she stood face to face with his older brother, offering her marriage like it was a lifeline. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Julian's gaze softened. Barely, but enough. "For appearances, maybe, but mostly," he hesitated just briefly, "because I couldn't bear to see you humiliated like this. Not you. You're turning me into a transaction," Isabel said bitterly, tears threatening again. "Something to trade for your image." Julian's jaw clenched. "Everyone expects you to join the Reed family today. I'm just making sure that still happens. This is ridiculous, Lily muttered. Izzy, we can leave now. You don't have to. I have nowhere to go, Isabel whispered, and even she was shocked at the truth of it. Her apartment was already handed over. Her clothes, mail, everything had been moved into Nathan's condo. She had taken time off from the hospital for their honeymoon. She had burned bridges to build a life that just collapsed. Julian stepped closer, closing the space between them. If you agree, he said carefully, this marriage will be on paper only. 1 year, then we separate quietly. You'll want for nothing. Financially, your life will continue as normal. You'll have your freedom, your work, your friends. I won't interfere. She studied him, searching for any sign of mockery. But instead, there was only determination and something else she couldn't name. We'd live together, she asked, to maintain the illusion. He paused. Separate bedrooms, unless you decide otherwise. Color flushed her cheeks. She looked away quickly. I keep my independence, she said firmly. My job, my patience, my life. Of course, he agreed. Neither of us is pretending this is real. A knock on the door broke the moment. Miss Hartman? The wedding planner's voice called. The guests are getting curious. The minister is ready. Time had run out. Julian extended his hand. The choice is yours. Isabel stared at it, solid, steady, and knew one thing. This man hadn't disappeared. He was standing here, offering her a way forward, however unorthodox. Maybe it was madness, but it was better than walking into the garden and announcing she'd been abandoned. She placed her hand in his. All right, she said, let's get married. Everything felt like a dream, a blurry, disjointed dream she couldn't wake from. Isabel couldn't remember walking down the stairs, couldn't feel Julian's hand wrapped around hers. All she could remember were the stairs, 200 guests turning to look, confusion in every face, shock tightening every jaw. A bride escorted not by her groom, but by his older brother. Each step beside Julian felt unreal. His face remained calm, eyes focused ahead, unreadable. Isabel felt like she was moving through someone else's life, dressed in a gown meant for another reality, one that had disappeared hours ago. The minister hesitated only slightly before proceeding. Maybe it was professionalism, maybe it was disbelief, or maybe it was fear of saying the wrong thing in a moment too strange to understand. Vows echoed through the warm afternoon air. Isabel heard her voice say, I do, unsure if she truly meant it or if she was simply clinging to the one thing left standing. Julian's voice followed, low, clear, unwavering. And then came the kiss, applause, a moment that should have been the happiest of her life. Julian turned to her. His eyes met hers, not soft, not fiery, but still something held her still. Then he leaned down and pressed his lips gently to hers. Quick, controlled, polite. But something in that kiss made her heart jolt in her chest. A kiss that was supposed to mean nothing had somehow left her breathless. That night, they returned to Julian's penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side. She stepped inside and felt immediately out of place. Everything was pristine. Marble, glass, brushed steel. Black, white, and gray tones ruled the room like a design magazine. No family photos, no scattered papers, no life. A home too perfect to feel lived in. Your room's at the end of the hall, Julian said quietly, placing a hand at her back to guide her. The space he'd prepared was elegant but impersonal. A large bed, floor-to-ceiling windows facing Central Park, an empty bookshelf, and a single folded card on the nightstand. Welcome home. No flowers, no wedding gift, no smile, but somehow that small gesture, the simplicity of it, tightened something in her chest. Julian turned to leave, but she stopped him. Do you regret it? She asked, barely above a whisper. He paused, hand on the doorframe. No. And then he was gone. For the first time that day, Isabel collapsed onto the bed and cried. Life after the wedding began with an unspoken set of rules between Isabel and Julian. They lived like strangers under the same roof. Separate rooms, no physical contact, no intimacy, and a deliberate sense of emotional distance. She had her own key. He had the passcode to her door but never used it. Meals were rarely shared. They passed each other with polite nods or silent acknowledgments. both clearly aware that closeness would unravel the fragile line they had drawn. But what Isabel didn't realize was that in that silence, Julian was watching her more closely than anyone ever had. Isabel had no idea that on the nights she buried herself in hospital shifts, there was a man staying up even later, not for his company, but for her. Julian never spoke of it, but he quietly followed every step of her work. He had read every medical article she'd ever published. He even kept a printed copy of a presentation she gave at a pediatric community health summit 2 years ago. The day she had no idea, a man sat in the back row, watching her intently for 40 uninterrupted minutes. From those small details, he began to build something bigger for her, silently, a research space, not to impress her, not to earn points, but to give Isabel something that was truly her own. A space where she didn't need to beg for grants, prove her worth, or defend her ambition just because she was too young to change the system. Julian spent more than 2 weeks transforming the west room of the penthouse into a miniature clinical simulation lab. He hired medical design consultants, handpicked every model, chose the lighting, sound, and video equipment so she could record and present her work. He called it your space, but he never said a word until she happened to stumble upon it one night. He didn't wait for gratitude. He didn't need her attention. It was enough for him to see her glance into the room each morning before work. For that alone, the day felt worthwhile. Julian wasn't good with words. He didn't know how to write sweet notes or make grand romantic gestures, but he had his own way, quiet, solid, and without demands, to care for someone, even if he hadn't yet dared to name what that feeling was. For Isabel, the room started out as a surprise, but soon it became a sanctuary, a place where she was reminded that someone believed in her, even if the rest of the world still doubted, and that someone was the last person she ever expected to believe in her at all. Each morning she found breakfast waiting on the kitchen counter, not an extravagant spread, but a carefully assembled plate, a slice of toast, a medium-boiled egg, chamomile tea, simple things she had once mentioned offhand during a dinner with Nathan. Julian never brought it up and Isabel never asked. But every time she saw the glass placed on the left side of the plate, the exact way she preferred it, something inside her shifted. She started noticing other small things. The hallway lights would dim at night and brighten when she came home late. The thermostat was always set just right on cold mornings. She never saw Julian do any of it, but somehow everything was quietly ready for her, intentional, thoughtful, and invisible. One evening after a long hospital shift, she passed the end of the hallway and noticed the door that had always been locked was open. Curiosity led her inside, and what she saw stopped her cold. It was a clinical simulation room, a fully equipped medical research space, work desks, reference shelves, whiteboards, even a neonatal heart model. On the board in bold handwriting were the words, "For ideas that save lives." She stood there, unable to breathe. Julian appeared at the doorway but didn't step in. "You said once you wanted to start a clinical research center for the community," he said. "I figured you should have a place to begin." She ran her fingers over the glass whiteboard, reading the notes, the diagrams, the words he'd written in his precise hand. Her throat tightened. No one had ever believed in her this quietly, this fully. She wanted to scream, or cry, or both. She had no words. Her chest tightened, overwhelmed by the realization that the distance he kept had nothing to do with indifference. That same night, something between them shifted. Dinner became a shared ritual. Julian surprisingly cooked. One night he made truffle mushroom pasta. Isabel watched him in a black apron, sleeves rolled up, fumbling with the recipe on his phone. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time since the wedding. Julian looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "You laughed," he said. "Is it that strange?" she teased. "No, just rare," he replied, pouring her a glass of wine, eyes warmer than she'd ever seen. That night after dinner, Isabel lingered at the table long after Julian had left to clean up. The candlelight flickered against the glass, casting golden shadows across the kitchen. For a long moment, she just sat there, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass, her heart strangely quiet. Quiet, but not empty. She thought back to the man who had walked into her bridal suite with the calm of someone used to controlling everything, and how, slowly, he had unraveled in front of her without saying a single word. A man who never touched her unless necessary, yet somehow made her feel held, seen. She stood, walked to the research room, and paused at the doorway. The lights were off, but the space hummed with purpose. His belief in her lingered in the air, like invisible hands gently pushing her forward. It terrified her, this feeling blooming in the quiet. Not dramatic, not consuming, just real, deep, solid. And for the first time, she caught herself wondering, not if she could love Julian, but if she already did. The thought made her breath catch. She wasn't ready to say it aloud. Not yet, but the ache in her chest told her one undeniable truth. She had stopped looking back at Nathan, and somehow, she had begun to see Julian. Their moments together became more frequent. One night, after a grueling shift, she returned with a sprained wrist. She didn't tell him, but the next morning, a cold compressed gel pack and a physical therapy guide were waiting outside her room. No note, no fuss, just quiet care. Julian's gestures weren't grand, but they hit her heart with surprising force. Under his hard shell and few words was a man who paid attention, deeply, honestly, and with purpose. Their feelings grew, unspoken but undeniable. And then came the night of the fundraiser gala. It was held at a high-rise in Midtown. Julian was the lead sponsor, Isabel the guest of honor. She wore an emerald green gown, hair pinned elegantly, her eyes glowing with a confidence she hadn't felt in months. Julian couldn't take his eyes off her. They barely spoke, but the way they moved, the way they stood side by side, it was obvious to everyone. They looked like the perfect couple. After the gala ended, it began to rain. They dashed to the car, raindrops clinging to their shoulders. Isabel reached for the door, but Julian caught her hand. His gaze locked with hers. No more restraint, no more distance. She didn't speak, didn't pull away. He leaned down, and this time the kiss wasn't ceremonial. It was real, deep, slow. It shook her to her core. She kissed him back without hesitation, because in that moment she knew. All the lines they drew had faded. The marriage they built on paper was starting to feel undeniably real. For a few fleeting days, their life felt different, lighter, meals together, shared glances, and the growing ache of something unspoken. And just when everything seemed to be finding a new rhythm, when the distance between them felt close enough to finally bridge, the past returned without warning, bringing a storm no one had seen coming. It all began on a gray, rainy afternoon. 3 days after the gala, just when things between Isabel and Julian had begun to soften, when dinners had started to fill the kitchen with quiet laughter and familiar warmth. Nathan returned. Isabel was walking out of the hospital after a 12-hour shift when she saw him standing there. By the curb, soaked in the drizzle, dark hair plastered to his forehead, eyes filled with something between hesitation and resolve. He hadn't come to charm her. He hadn't brought flowers or apologies. He carried only a thick brown envelope in his hand. "I know about you and Julian," he said without preamble, "and I know you think I left you, but no one ever told you the full story." Isabel froze, her grip tightening around her bag strap. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. Still, she nodded. They went into a nearby coffee shop, a place Isabel often used to sit and read between shifts. And at the same small corner table she once considered her quiet space, Nathan slid the envelope toward her. "This is everything I found." Inside were dozens of printed emails. Most of them came from Julian's address. The subject lines were cold, clinical. Hartman progress, observation and review. Her schedule, weekly update. Investment potential from Hartman Network. Some had photo attachments, candid shots of her at medical conferences, on hospital grounds, giving a guest lecture at Columbia 3 years ago. A few images were alarmingly sharp. Every line felt like a blade. Every photo struck like a blow to her chest. "Julian knew about you before I ever met you," Nathan said quietly. "He followed your career, invested in the charities you worked with, built connections with your hospital. I can't prove it, but I truly believe even me leaving you that day was part of a plan. He orchestrates everything." Isabel couldn't speak. She felt cold, not from the rain, but from the nausea rising inside her. Everything she thought was real, everything that felt like coincidence, might have been carefully laid out from the beginning. And Julian, the man she had just begun to trust, might have been behind it all. She left the coffee shop without a word. The rain still fell, but she didn't open her umbrella. Her steps were aimless, unsteady, cutting through a city that suddenly felt foreign. When she returned to the penthouse, Julian wasn't home. The space was cold and quiet. Everything looked the same, but her world had already tilted. She walked into the research room Julian had built for her, the one that had once brought tears to her eyes from sheer gratitude. And suddenly she couldn't breathe. The whiteboards, the neonatal heart models, his handwriting across the glass. All of it now felt like evidence, proof of a design she hadn't known she was a part of. She sank to the hardwood floor, her hands shaking. If all of it was a lie, what did that make her feelings? If the kiss on gala night had just been part of his strategy, then what was this ache tearing through her chest now? That night she didn't sleep. She packed a small suitcase, grabbed a few notebooks, her grandmother's old jewelry box. No note, no message. She stood for a long time in front of the room he built for her, hand resting on the doorknob. She almost opened it again. Almost. But sometimes, love too tightly held feels like a trap. She caught the 1:45 a.m. train, crossing state lines in darkness, heading back to Vermont, to her grandmother's old cabin, nestled between maple trees and the scent of summers long gone. The house was quiet and dusty. Floorboards creaked beneath her feet, but the silence gave her space to breathe. No need to read between Julian's silences. No need to hold up appearances. No tension behind restrained glances. Just her, the old fireplace, and a lifetime of memories. Julian didn't call, didn't text, didn't come after her. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. Because even if she hadn't said it, even if she'd walked away, part of her still hoped he would come, that he would explain, that he'd step outside his perfectly composed world and fight for her. Just once, but he didn't. He let her go, as if it didn't matter. A week passed. Isabel moved like a ghost, cooking out of habit, cleaning without purpose, lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. She didn't know which emotions were real anymore, which ones belonged to Julian, which ones were just the echo of what he'd left behind. Then on a quiet Saturday afternoon, as she sat curled in a worn blanket on the porch, watching the wind scatter leaves across the yard, a car pulled up. But it wasn't Julian, it was Richard Reed, Julian's father, the man who had looked down on her, who had once called her a girl with no legacy. "Miss Hartman," he said, stepping onto the porch, "I'm not here to take you back. I'm here to tell you the truth, because my son doesn't know how to." He handed her a folder. Inside were bank statements, a money transfer from his personal account to Nathan's, dated just a few days before the wedding. "I was the one who asked Nathan to leave," he said plainly. "I didn't want him to marry you. I thought you were using our family. Young doctor, no name, no power. I assumed you were a social climber." Isabel couldn't speak. "Julian didn't know," he continued. "And when everything fell apart, he didn't protect me. He protected you." "And the emails?" she asked, her voice raw. "They're real, but not what you think," Richard said. "Julian was interested. Yes, but not to manipulate, to protect. He admired you. He didn't know how to approach you, so he watched from a distance. And when Nathan came back, he made Julian the villain. It was easier than facing his own cowardice." A gust of wind swept the porch, stirring the scent of wet maple leaves. Isabel's thoughts slowed. Every memory, the quiet breakfasts, the clinical lab, the way he'd touched her wrist when she was hurt, the kiss that night, they all started making sense again. She looked up at Richard, and for the first time he bowed his head slightly. "Julian doesn't know how to say he loves someone," he said softly, "but he has. He has loved you, for longer than you know." Isabel felt her heart twist, and she knew, even after the storm, what remained was something she could no longer leave behind. After Richard left, Isabel sat in the old kitchen for hours, a cold cup of tea untouched in her hand. the stack of documents still clutched tightly. His words echoed in her mind like a storm that refused to quiet. She had thought Julian was the mastermind behind everything, a man who moved pieces on a chessboard. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He had loved her in silence for a very long time and just never knew how to say it. The next morning, sunlight crept gently through the maple trees. Isabel heard a soft sound on the porch. A plain envelope had been left by the door. No delivery driver, no name. Inside was a weathered leather-bound journal. The corners frayed, the pages slightly yellowed. She opened it and immediately recognized the handwriting. It was Julian's, his personal journal. The first page was dated September 23rd, 3 years ago. I've never believed in things like love at first sight, but today, walking into that lecture hall and seeing her explain blood circulation in premature infants, I understood what it meant to be drawn to someone in a single breath. She flipped through more pages, each entry a quiet, thoughtful glimpse into his world. He wrote about how she smiled when challenged, how she stood when she lectured, how her voice softened when speaking about babies who never made it to term. There were no calculations, no manipulation, just the raw, honest emotions of a man watching from afar, never daring to step too close. She laid her hand gently on the last page, her eyes blurred with tears. She knew what she had to do. That evening, she returned to New York. It was the night of the hospital's biggest annual fundraising gala. The ballroom at the plaza glowed with chandeliers and champagne. Laughter, string music, and camera flashes surrounded the crowd in formal black and glittering gowns. At the center of it all stood Julian, dressed in a black tuxedo, delivering the keynote speech. Isabel arrived just as he was beginning to speak. He talked about commitment to the future of pediatric care, about funding young physicians, about investing in neonatal research. His voice was calm, steady, like the man himself. But his eyes, they kept scanning the crowd, as if searching for something or someone. And then he saw her. She wore a silk emerald dress, no heavy makeup, no dramatic hair, but her eyes were full of certainty and truth. She didn't wait for him to finish. She stepped forward. Whispers stirred through the crowd as she made her way to the stage. She stood beside him, reached for the hand still holding the microphone. "Julian," she said clearly, her voice unwavering, "this time I came for love. No contract, no fear, no more misunderstanding." The room fell completely silent. Julian looked at her. In his eyes, first surprise, then softness, then something bottomless and quiet. He set the microphone down and wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly like nothing else in the world mattered more than having her back in his arms again. The moment he wrapped his arms around her, Isabel felt the world exhale, like it had been holding its breath for far too long. The stage, the lights, the curious eyes of 100 guests, all faded. All that remained was the sound of his heartbeat, steady and strong, pulsing against her cheek like a song she had once forgotten how to hear. Julian said nothing. He simply held her, long enough for time to lose its meaning. And when he rested his forehead gently against hers, there was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not control, not restraint, but pure relief. The quiet kind that only comes when you finally touched what your heart has ached for in silence. She didn't ask. He didn't need to explain. One hand clasp, one breathless closeness. That was all it took for them to know. They had found each other again. This time, no contracts, no distance, only love, whole and unguarded. 1 year after Isabel had left Vermont, her world had changed. But the biggest transformation didn't come from a place or a job. It came from within her. She was no longer the girl who entered a marriage to salvage her dignity. No longer the woman who once believed she was just a piece in someone else's grand design. Now she was someone who chose her own path, with love that wasn't conditional, orchestrated, or born from obligation. The free pediatric clinic in a quiet corner of Brooklyn stood as proof. A wooden sign carved with the words Hartman Pediatric Wellness Center for every child swayed gently among ivy vines, welcoming every child in need of healing. Behind the modern facility, no one saw the man who funded every inch of it, from medical equipment to scholarships for young doctors. Julian never appeared at the grand opening. He simply left a note, handwritten, "Thank you for never giving up on the children who need you." Isabel had cried reading that note, not for the gift, but for the way he loved, with no performance, no presence, yet always there, like a steady, quiet heartbeat. That afternoon, she left the clinic earlier than usual. Julian was waiting in the car. He drove them out of the city, down familiar roads, until the lakeside estate came into view under a gentle golden sky. This was where, 1 year ago, they had been married in chaos and confusion. But this time, everything was different. No judging eyes. No whispered gossip from extended family or curious guests. Only real friends, a few colleagues who knew their story, and a soft evening filled with golden reflections dancing on the lake's surface. Isabel stepped out from the cabin behind the house in a soft ivory dress made just for her. Simple, elegant. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders. Her face wore almost no makeup, but her eyes sparkled like they had finally found home. Julian stood at the end of a path sprinkled with white petals. No microphone, no grand speech, no rehearsed vows. Just him, simple, steady, but with a gaze that said more than any words ever could. He took her hand and placed a small velvet box in her palm. Inside was a ring, the same black diamond from before, now redesigned. Encircling it was a platinum band carved with fine lines mimicking blood vessels, tiny roads that led to the heart. "You deserve a beginning you chose," he said softly, "not one you had to surrender to." Isabel looked at him, her heart tightening. She remembered the nights they first lived together, silent, distant. She remembered the way he touched her hand when she cut herself, the kiss under the gala rain, and the days she thought he wouldn't come for her. But he was still here. She smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. "This time I choose you," she whispered. "Not because I have to, but because I want to, every single day." And she meant it with every breath in her body. This wasn't surrender. This was freedom. No applause followed, no cheers, only silence, sacred and still. The kind that wrapped around two people who had survived misunderstanding, distance, and forgiveness. A quiet vow, a firm embrace, a kiss that asked for nothing, because everything had already been understood. There was no towering cake, no fireworks, no stage. But as they stood together, watching the lake shimmer under the last light of day, Isabel knew this was home, not because of an event, but because of the man beside her, this time forever.